Today I wanted to show Titans some love again and share the build that I've been running in endgame content lately. The beauty of today's build is that I think it's going to remain pretty strong in Edge of Fate because we've already had the chance to take a sneak peek at the artifact we will have on launch. So save this build as a loadout and give it a whirl next season with the new artifact mods. Now since Ghosts of the Deep came out for Rite of the Nine, WinterBite has kind of resurged in popularity, thanks mainly in part due to the artifact mods this season and the general fact that the encounters in Ghosts of the Deep were very up close and personal. So I'll cover everything you'll need to play around with this strong build. Before I jump into the video, I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who has been coming back to my channel and watching my content. If you have any suggestions on how I can improve my videos, please leave a comment with some feedback or ideas and I'll definitely read through them. Anyway, I hope you find my video useful and give this build a try for yourself. Now this build mainly revolves around Strand. The reason for this is because we have quite a few artifact mods this season that synergize with Strand, making it strong for both DPS and ad clear. In addition to this, we have quite a few artifact mods next season that should perfectly transition with our current artifact mods. We're going to have mods that increase grenade and super regen with woven mail, or increase melee regen and damage with woven mail, and even when picking up a tangle will grant ability energy, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. I just wanted to point out that this build will have synergy next season too. So to begin, let's start with the aspects. Strand Titan has access to some very strong options for survivability, namely Banner of War and Into the Fray. Both of these aspects are insane for survivability in endgame PvE, especially in content where your light level is capped. Looking at each one individually, starting with Banner of War, it reads, defeat a target with a melee attack, finisher, or sword to raise a Banner of War that pulses with energy, periodically healing nearby allies and increasing melee and sword damage. Targets defeated by you and nearby allies charge the banner, increasing the speed of its pulses. This aspect is one of the best in the game in my opinion. It is very easy to trigger the effects of this aspect, and not only does it provide you with a decent chunk of healing, it also scales the damage of your melee attacks. At times 4, it is up to 40% extra damage on your melee attacks, and it also benefits glaives by up to 25%. If you have Syntheseps active, then these gains are actually slightly less, and for good reason. Melee damage stacking has traditionally been pretty busted in content where you're able to smack a boss repeatedly, so this is Bungie's way of toning it down a bit. For the second aspect, Into the Fray reads, destroying a tangle or casting your super grants woven mail for nearby allies. While you have woven mail, your melee regeneration rate is increased. Now this aspect is also strong in its own right, and has a little secret that even I didn't know about for a while. When you destroy a tangle, the point of impact or detonation actually releases 3 healing pulses, in addition to granting woven mail. This stacks with the healing from Banner of War as well. Plus the melee regeneration rate increase for just having woven mail is 300% in PvE. Now moving on to the fragments that tie this build together. First we have Thread of Warding, where picking up an Orb of Power grants woven mail. This one is pretty straightforward. Whenever you pick up an Orb of Power, it will give you 5 seconds of woven mail, and this will trigger the effects of Into the Fray, which makes them the perfect setup. Now I believe woven mail is 45% DR, which stacks with other sources of damage resistance that you might gain from your teammates or activity modifiers. A nice little trick that you can use is that woven mail gained from Into the Fray lasts for 10 seconds instead of 5, and picking up an orb with this fragment will give you the full 10 seconds instead of 5 seconds if you already had woven mail triggered from a tangle. The second fragment that I recommend is Thread of Transmutation. While you have woven mail, weapon final blows create a tangle. The ability to make tangles for additional sources of woven mail and healing fits really nicely into the build's identity and adds another alternative for you to create tangles. Now the third fragment that I recommend is the old reliable Thread of Generation. Dealing damage generates grenade energy. This is one of the strongest fragments available in the entire Strand subclass, as just by dealing damage to targets you will receive constant grenade energy, allowing you to utilize your grenade ability more frequently. The last fragment in this build is kind of up to personal preference. I really like using Thread of Isolation, as landing precision hits emits a severing burst from the target, and being able to apply sever to groups of enemies even at range can be life-saving. This is also a really effective way to strand debuff targets and use them to generate tangles in the first place, without having to rely on your abilities or an artifact mod. The number of shots required to trigger Thread of Isolation vary based on the archetype, but so long as you continue to land headshots, you'll sever groups of targets very often. If you personally don't like Thread of Isolation, then an alternative fragment I would recommend in this slot is Thread of Fury. Damaging targets with a tangle grants melee energy. Depending on the number and the tier of each enemy that you hit with a tangle, it can give you between 10 and 30% of your melee back per enemy, which would synergize with the rest of your build. For your abilities, unfortunately on Strand, you don't have many options. You have one melee and one super, so there is no freedom of choice there. For your grenade, I would strongly recommend running Grapple Grenade, as the melee attack from your grapple functions and benefits from both grenade and melee effects, so it will benefit from the increased damage from Banner of War, and potentially both the tier 20 grenade and melee stats in Edge of Fate. Now moving on to your weapons, the options that you have are pretty fluid depending on the content that you want to do. But as a general all-purpose loadout for this build specifically, I recommend a Strand primary weapon that has some decent damage perk options, such as Rufus's Fury or Old Sterling if you like auto rifles, or perhaps something like Unloved from Sundered Doctrine if you prefer hand cannons. Having a Strand primary will allow you to take advantage of some of the artifact perks, which I will come back to later. In your energy slot, I recommend a special weapon that deals decent damage to bulky targets like champions or mini-bosses, such as a fusion rifle or sniper rifle. Alternatively, utilize the weapon slot to help generate more orbs of power, which you can use for woven mail and healing. The best weapon for this purpose is VS Velocity Baton from Vesper's Host Dungeon. And in your heavy slot for this build, I'm suggesting WinterBite. Since it's a glaive, it will gain a damage bonus from your subclass setup, and the exotic itself gains an inherent glaive melee damage bonus from the exotic perk. So with all these sources of increased damage, this heavy weapon can put out some serious amounts of damage even in difficult content when the encounter allows for it. Moving on to the mods and your armor. At the end of the day, your stat distribution will depend entirely on your personal playstyle. Because Strand Titan is often an overly aggressive playstyle, I would suggest running 100 resilience, and then aim to have the stats evenly split between melee and discipline, or as even as you can get them, since you get diminishing returns the higher a stat is. Now regarding Edge of Fate, the preferred stats may change depending on the potency and effectiveness of tier 20 stats, and I'm sure the Destiny community will identify the optimal stats in due time. So incorporate the stat distribution that works best for your playstyle. Now for your exotic armor piece, the most well-rounded exotic for this kind of build is always Syntheseps. It synergizes with almost all aggressive builds due to its high melee damage scaling, as well as the handling bonus. That makes it fit perfectly into the identity of Strand Titan. Now for your armor mods. Starting with your helmet, a Strand Siphon will help you generate additional orbs with your primary weapon, and from there you can run a hands-on mod or two for additional super energy. On your gauntlets, run at least one heavy-handed, as this will allow both your melee and your grapple grenade to generate an orb of power. I suggest a Strand Reloader, as this makes your primary weapons much smoother. Your chest piece should be focused on resist mods and should have them based on the enemy types you're facing. Run reserves if you really want to, but I recommend running resist 99% of the time. On your boots, I suggest running one recuperation and one better already to get a chunk of health on orb pickup. Since you're going to be focused on generating orbs throughout the gameplay loop for woven mail, it should be easy to take advantage of this. For your last mod, I suggest either a scavenger or a stasis holster mod to ensure that your WinterBite is either always reloaded or has some ammo to spare. And finally, on your class item, I always suggest running Special Finisher and Proximity Ward, allowing you to generate special ammo safely and perform finishes even in dangerous situations. The last mod is really up to you, but Reaper is always a very reliable option. For your artifact, these are the mods that I think are essential to the build. In the first column, pick your anti-champion mods that are required for the activity you're playing. And just remember that if you pick Unstoppable Glaive, then activities with the Overcharge modifier will also buff glaives. In the second column, Unravelling Orbs will work really well with your Strand weapon, giving you bonus damage and add clear potential, and Vile Weave for improved tangles and decreased cooldown will be very useful in the build. In the third column, Hold the Line will give WinterBite the ability to heal you, which will stack on top of Banner of War, and Elemental Siphon is the other good option in this column because it will give you super energy whenever you pick up or destroy a tangle. In the fourth column, Nobel is a must pick to improve the damage output of WinterBite, and this is especially important for DPS phases. It's very easy to trigger if you block any incoming damage, and you will get a massive damage bonus for 5 seconds. Horde Shuttle will pair really well with Unravelling Orbs, as applying Unraveling to targets will be very easy to do after you pick up an orb. In the fifth column, you should run 2 shreds, as the Woven Mail hotspots benefit not only you, but also your team. In addition to the base artifact mod, the bonus improves the damage of your Unraveling rounds, which is just going to benefit your primary weapon even more. And if you want to, Limit Break will be very easy to trigger with how much uptime you have on Woven Mail. Post-edit, I'm curious if casting your super to give yourself Woven Mail from Into the Fray will trigger Limit Break or not. Now, this build doesn't necessarily have a gameplay loop, but it does have a gameplay style, and that is be aggressive and be in the enemy's faces. The first thing you want to do is get Banner of War active. You could trigger ×1 with a simple melee on a red bar, or get a finisher on any kind of enemy. But once you have Banner of War active, subsequent kills either with your abilities or with your weapons, and that could be any of your weapons, will contribute to powering up Banner of War and increasing the stacks that you have. Higher stacks means better damage output and better healing. When you've got Banner of War rolling, then you can start pushing up a bit more aggressively. Constantly be thinking of a way to generate orbs of power without slowing your momentum too much. This way, if you actively keep the rough position of the orbs in the back of your mind, you can utilize them throughout the engagement to re-up Woven Mail or give yourself a little bit more healing when you need it. A side effect to the larger stacks of Banner of War is that it gets harder to keep refreshing the buff, and you will eventually lose the stacks altogether. Using your super is an excellent way to restart your Banner of War stacks while providing both damage resist and a DPS option. And finally, whenever you are making use of WinterBite, always remember to block frequently, typically at the end of your melee combo, so that any stray damage from another ad can trigger the artifact perk Nobel and give you the extra damage bonus that will let you shred even bosses. Now, as always, I want to highlight the areas where I think the builds lack or need support, with Rite of the Nine being the go-to activity at the moment, and Prophecy being the dungeon of the week. This is likely going to be where most people will be testing or trying this build. You will find that the build feels weak or lackluster when the ad density is very low or sparse, because this will make it hard to sustain Banner of War, especially at the higher stacks, and without your healing and damage boost, it makes the build feel kinda weak. There isn't really a very good option to offset this, since enemy kills are enemy kills. If they're not there, they're not there. The second weakness this build has is that against hard-hitting one-shot enemies, this build won't help you survive with an abundance of damage resistance. If you get hit with a boss stomp or a melee attack, the healing from the build will not let you tank it. You don't have restoration, you have healing pulses. So keep this in mind when you go to aggress bosses like the enemies in the cube room of Prophecy, especially on ultimatum mode. And finally, the third weakness, like all other close range builds, is long range fights are your weakness, full stop. If the boss moves away quickly or keeps you at a distance, then this build sucks. In Prophecy, you really will only see the benefit for this build in the first encounter, and possibly the traversals with the Minotaurs and the Taken Bubbles. But in the cube room, the ad density is too low, and the final boss requires ranged loadouts. In a week's time, when all the dungeons become available at once, I recommend you give this build a try in the first and second encounters of Ghosts of the Deep, as those are close range, high density ad fights where the builds shine. And that about wraps up everything that I wanted to share with you. Please let me know in the comments if you have your own version of this build and what you think can make the build even stronger. As always, I appreciate everyone who watched to the end, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. See ya.